group of happy survivors of Wednesday night. I'm Charlie Seemann, the Executive Director of the Western Folklife Center, and I want to welcome you to the 29th National Cowboy Poetry Gathering. This is when we do our keynote speech, and I should tell you at the very outset here, our keynote speaker, James Galvin, is trapped in Iowa by weather and has not been able to get here. But our wonderful technical crews here have scrambled all evening in this be able to teleport him here. We were going to try to have a hologram, but that didn't quite come together. And we talked to the folks at Star Trek and thought maybe we could beam him in, but they didn't think they could get him over Utah. But the miracles of Skype, we think this is going to work. We'll know in a couple of minutes here. I want to thank our sponsor who sponsors us every year, the Nevada Humanities Organization. How about a nice hand for them, Nevada Humanities? Just before the gathering this year, we've lost 3 of the gathering, the Folklife Center's best friends and supporters. Too late to get them into the Empty Saddles part of the program booklet, but I would like to mention that our great longtime board member and supporter and benefactor, George Gunn III, passed away last week. At the age of 75, he was fighting cancer. George was an incredible guy. I know a lot of you got to meet him over the years here. He purchased the Pioneer building for us. The G3 Bar Theater in the Folklife Center is named for George, and we are really going to miss him. He was a force of nature, for those of you who know him. The epic eyebrows, just enjoyed life minute to minute. We also lost a couple of our artists. Rod McQuarrie, a local poet and rancher from here, passed away. Will also be missed. And Howard Norskog, who hasn't been here for a while, but also I'm sure some of you remember him. So let's hold them in our thoughts, and we're doing this for them this year. I want to bring out Bill Watson, who's one of our board members, just going to say a couple of words on behalf of the Board of Trustees. Bill?
Hey, good morning, folks. Welcome to springtime in Elko, Nevada. The good news is I'm not your keynote speaker this morning. I just learned I was coming up to do this. Stewart Wilson, our chair, couldn't be here. On behalf of Stewart Wilson, the Board of Trustees, the staff of the Western Folklife Center, I too wish to add my welcome to the 29th Annual National Cowboy Poetry Gathering. All right. You know, Charlie and I are but mere mortals as compared to the artist who will grace the stage in the days to come. And well, these venues are the big tent under which we gather to share our art with enchanted audiences. The real underpinnings of this gathering, as is true with so many cultural events and organizations, are the sponsors, the stakeholders, the members, and the volunteers that make it all possible. Big questions face us in the coming years, and it's not uncommon. Will there be enough young people to carry on the traditions and keep this gathering moving forward? Your gifts and charitable donations, either as a stakeholder, a member, or simply volunteering your time, will ensure that young folklorists continue this gathering for generations to come. Please become a member or a stakeholder of the Western Folklife Center or volunteer your time, and we'll keep this moving forward. For those who already do, we are eternally grateful. Many thanks to each and every one of you. Go forth and have a wonderful week. Thank you all.
Thanks, Bill. To introduce our keynote speaker, James Galvin, we're going to bring out one of our favorite poets, who's also a board member, has been coming, I think, to the gathering now since 1989. We were just reminiscing about all that backstage. And he's going to say a few words about Mr. Galvin and introduce him. John Doffelmeyer.
I have the pleasure this morning to introduce James Galvin as our keynote speaker. Of course, I had no idea that he wouldn't be here in the flesh. And it's entitled Fencing the Sky, a very fun, enjoyable read. I really recommend that, to just get used to James's work. Okay, with no further ado and keep our fingers crossed, please welcome James Galvin.
Okay. Endangered Species. Ray Worcester froze to death a quarter of a mile from my house in a spring blizzard in 1983, but that was neither the beginning nor the end. Lyle Van Wanning died of emphysema in 1988. By that time, I had already begun writing a book about the end. In 1980, I had 3 neighbors, Ray and Lyle, both about 2 miles away, and the Lilly family down on the Chimney Rock Ranch, whose headquarters was 7 miles away. Frank Lilly died of cancer in 1984, and the family had to leave the ranch they'd managed since 1950. In 1980, the owners of the Chimney Rock sold all of its holdings in Colorado, about 10,000 acres, to a real estate development company, which chopped that land into 40-acre ranchettes. Lyle was still alive, but near the end. My daughter was 4, and I knew she would grow up not knowing the way the land had been, nor the gentle, wise, and colorful people that had once inhabited it, and who had a right relationship with their place. I had to write a record of what was gone, so that when my daughter grew up, she could know what we had lost, and perhaps join the effort to save what was left. In the front of that book it says, "I wrote this book for Emily," and that is true. I never intended to publish it. I thought of myself as a poet, and what I was writing seemed very personal. How the meadow found its way into print is another story and not worth going into. I wanted to write about 100 years of the history of 360 acres of bottomland in a once remote part of Colorado. I wanted to write that history from the point of view of the land itself, with the people blowing through like another kind of weather. I wanted to present a sense of temporality that I imagined a landscape might experience, in which each present moment was inhabited by all moments past, and by implication, therefore, all moments future. A snowstorm today could be a snowstorm 100 years ago. A blue heron skimming the willows could be a blue heron 100 years ago. The tall grass now could be the tall grass then. Of course, inhabiting the point of view or points of view of a landscape is not possible, but I thought it would be a good thing to try. All the stories in the meadow are true, but I needed to fill them out, be painterly, because those narratives were related to me in a skeletal, typically Western, laconic style. If I needed to get inside someone's head 100 years ago, well, that I had to imagine. I had to make it up. The result was a sui generis work that isn't really fiction or nonfiction. I liked it, that it was just a book. I liked it that I never knew where to find it in the bookstore. Sometimes it was in fiction, sometimes nonfiction, sometimes natural history, sometimes memoir. That I hated because the book is not about me. Since the Meadows publication, the lyric essay was invented, and some people think I'm guilty of that. Because of its hopscotch form and intimately esoteric subject, I was surprised that people read it. I was further surprised that it was appreciated by stock growers and environmentalists alike, because there was so much animosity between those two groups. The upshot there was that I got a grant from the Lila Wallace Foundation to partner with the Nature Conservancy. I spent 3 consecutive falls traveling from nowhere to nowhere in eastern Montana and Wyoming, in National Guard armories, schoolhouses, churches, and homes, under the guise of presenting a literary event. I tried to get environmentalists and ag people to stop yelling at each other. I tried to encourage them to join forces in an effort to protect their common interests from the corporate rapacity that threatens both the environment and the horse-based culture we call ranching. My main hope was that I wouldn't get shot. The results amazed me. I could point out that there is more wildlife diversity on a well-run family ranch than there is, with the possible exception of Yellowstone, in a national park. The dominant species in a national park is people. I could suggest that letting wolves reintroduce themselves rather than having humans reintroduce them had a better chance of keeping wolves out of trouble. I could suggest that no, cattle don't cause more erosion than buffalo, proper grazing is good for grass, and that riparian irrigation encourages waterfowl. Then there was the economic issue. Cattlemen and sheepmen, though they may have millions of dollars invested in land, livestock, and machinery, often live below the poverty line. Environmentalists have the means to raise a lot of money and lobby Washington. Organizations like the Nature Conservancy foster cooperation among people who didn't know they had common interests, common fears. Ultimately, folks wanted to know what they could do. I said, stop electing the fox to be in charge of the chickens. Start with the local, county commissioners, and go global, state senators, governors, presidents. But that's where I hit the wall. Corporate interests control our politics, politicians lie, the Supreme Court makes terrible choices, and the corporate rapacity of big oil and real estate development crush our landscape and the way of life that is uniquely Western. At this point, I'm not optimistic, but I still have hope. I see the development of renewable energy, and some ranchers, despite the odds, are holding on to their way of life. Both environmentalists and ranchers need all the help they can get. Endangered species need to stick together. The way people watch television while they eat, looking up to the TV and down to take a bite and back up, that's how Lyle watches the meadow out the south window while he eats his breakfast. He's hooked on the plot, doesn't want to miss anything. He looks out over the rim of his cup as he sips. The meadow is under 2 feet of snow, which looks gray but not dirty in this light. Leafless willow branches make an orange streak down the middle. Each year the snow tries to memorize blindly the landscape as if it were the landscape that was going to melt in the spring. The wind has cleared a couple of the knobs above the meadow, and the silver gray sage throbs out. Above that stands the front line of timber where the trees begin or end, depends back up. Lyle says, "What kept you?" The sparrow hops onto the windowsill as a chickadee lights and begins bouncing up and down on the juniper branch just left by the other. And you cheerful little son of a bitch, you don't waste no time either, do you? Lyle slowly straightens his stiff joints as he gets out of the chair and shuffles, his shoes are untied, over to the wood stove. He picks up the plate with the extra pancake, carries it back to the table and sits down. He cranks the window open about an inch, not enough for the birds to come in and kill themselves trying to get out, pinches off some warm pancake, and crumbles it onto the outside sill. Little beggars. When the day's first visitors have finished their crumbs and flown, Lyle picks up a 2-month-old newspaper Ed Wilkes brought and begins to read. But he is soon interrupted by a tiny beak tapping on the glass. This one is a junco, and then the chickadee is back, bouncing from branch to branch, chirping. Lyle gives them some crumbs, addressing the chickadee, "I don't know what you're so goddamn happy about all the time." There's a racket of chirps and squawks by the front door. Lyle unbends out of the chair, takes another pinch of flapjack to the door, steps outside on the stoop. The screeching squawk is a Steller's jay who flees the wire he's perched on as soon as the door opens. He's had enough stones and snowballs pitched at him to know. To the little row of sparrows that has returned to the perch, Lyle says, "That hatchet head won't bother you now." All at once they fly down and light on his uplifted palm. They peck off pieces of cake and flee back to the wire like greedy children waiting another turn. Then the pancake is gone, and Lyle goes back inside to wash the dishes. Once, coming back from town, I saw Lyle's truck parked at the wooden shoe. I stopped to say hello. Lyle was building a new garden fence, and as I approached, he held up his hand, a signal not to come closer. Then he leaned his shovel against the post he was setting and walked slowly across the garden to where a barn swallow was perched on a rail. Lyle took off his glove and with the back of his huge index finger touched the swallow gently under its throat, then ran his finger down once gently over its breast. Then he put his glove back on and walked away, and the bird took to the air again. Lyle said, "Up close, them swallows are the funniest damn looking things you ever saw. They fly like angels, and then up close they look like little clowns. Damnedest thing." It's just a pitchfork with the handle sawn off and the tines forged over to 90 degrees, a specialized tool for pulling mud and willow sticks from culverts and irrigation ditches. Lyle sits hunched over on the tailgate. His hip boots are turned down. He flops the handle of his ditch tool back and forth from hand to hand between his knees. He smells mint growing in the willow bushes along the creek, listens to the even cadences of Ray's treatise on the supreme intelligence of beavers. Lyle is not all that receptive to Ray's point of view. Ray worked as a ditch rider and caretaker of a reservoir. His official title was water engineer. This is Ray talking. "A beaver can construct a sturdy enough dam to stanch near any mountain torrent. He likes a reservoir. He doesn't need a backhoe or dynamite. Now that's a water engineer. He isolates his house out in the middle with the door underwater so he won't be bothered." Lyle interrupts, "Maybe I should have built my door underwater." "You should have. That beaver has perfect security. He's warm all winter and has plenty of supplies. Going to town for him is as far as the nearest aspen tree. That's usually where the coyotes kept him." Lyle stops flip-flopping the handle and looks hard at Ray. Ray pretends not to notice and keeps talking. "When the pond freezes to his liking, he goes down to the dam to pull out a few sticks, like turning the crank on the reservoir, and lets out a little water. He lowers the level to make an airspace and room to swim around in there. He does it before the ice is too thick so he can't get trapped inside. It's just like that air holodome in Collins. In summer, that water is so still, it works just like a burglar alarm." Lyle listens. He knows all this, but that doesn't make it any less interesting. It isn't what people say, he thinks. How they say it is what really tells you what they're talking about. His sour mood is not the result of disagreeing. In fact, quite the opposite. Lyle hates it when Ray says things he agrees with. "Sure, they're smart, Ray, but that don't mean I have to like the sons of bitches. Being smart just makes it worse. Makes them better at being a pain in the ass. Makes you feel guilty for trapping them. Hell, Ray, people are smart." The inkling of a smile begins to play around the corners of Ray's mouth. He's about to experience the sublime joy of getting Lyle's goat. "I suppose you'd feel that way about coyotes if you was a sheep herder. Why they're smart is why they're an aggravation. Number one, I ain't a sheep herder. And number two, I'll tell you who's the aggravation. Now Ray just beams. He covers his grin with his hand to hide the teeth he's missing. They stop talking. Lyle thinks about how good beavers are for the meadow since they raise the level of the creek and slow the water down so it has time to seep into the subsoil. When they plug the ditches, though, they mess up everything. Lyle doesn't like being forced to trap them. Last summer, he tried to trap a beaver near the flume with the usual shoulder-hold victors that drown them, but expert as he was, he could not. Some beavers, like coyotes, cannot be fooled. One morning, he found a trap sprung and there was a toenail in its jaws. Lyle knew enough not to be encouraged by this. It meant that beaver would be even more careful, at least for a while. Lyle then hooked up a 12-volt battery to a wire he strung across the pond about an inch above the surface. When he came back the next morning, more or less expecting to find a beaver floating dead on its back with smoke still coming out of its ears, instead he found that the beaver had raised the water a notch and shorted out the wire. That beaver must have been impressed with Lyle's ingenuity, though. It moved upstream and started to rankle Ray. It plugged the culvert under the road that leads to Ray's house. The water rose and washed out the road. Ray was calm. He didn't want to drown a beaver cruelly in the usual trapper's manner, so he went down there 4 nights running with a bottle, a flashlight, and a shotgun. He never saw anything. He needed some sleep. The next morning, the culvert was plugged and the road had a chasm 4 feet deep running across it. Ray was cut off and pissed off. He built an elaborate scarecrow and dressed it in clothes he wore all the time for musk value. That worked one night. Then the beaver got wise and sawed off the road again. Ray waited in an ambush bush another 4 nights and didn't see anything. He parked his truck down there, which worked one more night only. Ray was devoting his life to this beaver. He broke down and set traps near the places he could see where the beaver slipped in and out of the water, leaving little muddy slides in the bank's sweet grass. One morning I went over to have coffee with Ray and found his truck parked down by the culvert. Ray was slumping on the tailgate like he was passed out from booze, but hadn't fallen over yet. But it was too early in the morning for that, even for Ray. I walked up and there was the biggest female beaver I have ever seen laid out drowned in the back of the truck. Ray didn't look up. He said, "There's a whole mountain back there with streams and springs to plug no end. If I could have scared her, but she wouldn't scare." Then he looked at me. And when he looked at me, his tears made freshets down his cheeks. We walked to the house for coffee before skinning her out. The dark shapes of the sand rocks were like boats at anchor. They threaded their horses through them. Oscar said, "Sorry you had to wait for me to milk that blamed cow." Ernie said, we ain't burned no daylight yet." They plashed across Sand Creek and loped up the far bank. They talked as they rode, about horses and rodeo and cows and basketball and their respective parents. Ernie was 2 years older than Oscar, a dark, good-looking kid hired on at 14 as a rock-bottom wage ranch hand who wanted to be a real cowboy someday. Oscar hadn't, but had sometimes wanted to ask his older friend about sex. Not how you do it, every ranch kid knows that, but more, how do you work things around so that you can get it done? Finally, riding through the sharp-smelling sage, he mustered the gumption to ask, but it turned out that Ernie didn't know either, though he allowed us how he'd about considered it to death. They rode up the watershed between the 2 creeks. Oscar was playing with his lariat, swinging it over his head like idle thoughts, since there wasn't a cow in sight, roping yucca and larkspur, roping his horse's front feet and letting him step out of the loop like the dead broke cow horse he was. By mid-morning it was scorching, hotter than young love, as Frank used to say, and they still hadn't seen a cow. The Camel Rock Ranch was big enough to support several thousand cow-calf pairs, which meant it was also big enough to ride over all day and not see any of them, just because you didn't happen to ride in the right place. At noon, they saw some cows on the far side of Sand Creek, which that far up spooled at the bottom of a huge canyon. The cows weren't far off in a straight line, but the two boys had to ride for an hour to negotiate the downside of the canyon and find a place to cross that was anything less than breakneck. Then they rode another half hour, picking their way up the steep far side. Both kept their toes barely in the stirrups in case a horse should fall in the scree. It was like swimming a horse through loose gravel. When they came up on the other side, the cows were gone. By picking up tracks, they found them, 20 pair or so, all pretty healthy looking. Ernie said, rubbing his neck, "I don't know, but what that little brockle face isn't looking somewhat peaked." Oscar was building a heel loop before Ernie finished his sentence. They cut out the calf and started following it, first at a trot, Ernie off to the left, Oscar back a length and to the right. When he had his loop ready, Ernie spurred his horse into a gallop. The calf zigzagged, but the good horse bore down on him like a heat-seeking missile. Ernie swung his rope and laid down a perfect throw. He took his time making a dally, keeping his horse running along behind the calf. When Ernie dallied and turned his horse, the calf swung around like a rowboat into a river on a long painter. Oscar's horse quartered across and made the corner behind the calf. He threw his loop downward so that it folded over the calf's loins. The calf made the rest happen, made the loop stand, stepped into it with both hind legs. Standing in his stirrups, Oscar took up the slack like a fly fisherman setting the hook. He stopped his horse and dallied, lifting the calf into the air, stretched between the two horses. Ernie said under his breath, "Too bad the kid can't rope." There was nothing really wrong with the calf, but they shoved some sulfa pills down his throat anyway, unwilling to admit they were just having fun. They turned the bawling brockle-faced calf loose, running for its mother. They tied their horses to a wizened cedar tree that sang a dry song in the wind. They sat in its shade. Neither kid had brought any lunch, nor even any water. As for food, they could tough it out. As for water, two kids who knew the country as well as these should be able to find some. But for a long while, they just sat in the shade and listened to the light summer breeze and the cedar needles. Ernie said, "You need to tighten the curb chain on your bridle." Oscar said, "Ernie, what in the hell are you going to do?" "I don't know. Look for work. A ranch to work on. Maybe I'll be the foreman of a big old ranch like your dad is." "There ain't no big old ranches anymore. Rich people just buy them to hide their money in. That's what Dad says. And the job you're wanting is already taken. Maybe I'll do something else." "What?" "Something." They mounted up and rode back across the canyon and up toward the timber. "You thirsty?" "You?" "The spring at the running waters dried up along with nearly every other spring this year. I didn't notice you getting a drink when we crossed the creek and watered the horses. I ain't desperate enough yet to drink out of a lukewarm creek that's had cows in it. Where's the nearest spring?" "Trent's is the best. We could ride up there. I bet they'd give us a drink. Right now I could drink a couple of gallons of that spring water." "I guess the reason you don't shut up about it is you're afraid your mouth will stick closed." "Damn if I ain't." They touched their horses up into a smart walk and turned their heads toward Trent's. That was another 3 scorched-out miles, and they were sure thirsty by then, as much from dwelling on it as anything else. They thought they'd never been so thirsty nor would be again. They felt like they were dust all the way through. When they rode up the leopard-spotted aspen shade to the old homestead cabin, they could see no vehicle of any kind and thought no one was home. Suddenly, Ernie's eyes flared like a scared colt's. Oscar looked too. It was old man Trent's daughter, Ad's sister, a girl just a year or two older than Ernie. She was on the front porch, sunbathing, in a minuscule bikini. Ernie woke up, said, "Jesus," then moved his rein hand and walked forward. Kathy had seen them coming, had heard them talking as they crossed the draw, but she didn't look up from her book until they were sitting their horses by the front gate. She was a striking redhead with green Irish eyes and the cheekbones to match. Her waist-length hair was piled on top of her head. Her skin was like white chocolate. Oscar and Ernie held their dusty hats by the crowns, not meaning to, over their hearts. She eyed them over the top of her novel. Hi, Ernie. Hi, Oscar. Ernie made a froggish noise in his throat and then managed, howdy. Oscar was pretty much lacking oxygen, and a funny feeling was ranging from his burning ears, which had suddenly started ringing, to his toes, which at that moment were strangely beyond consideration. Oscar opened his mouth, but nothing came out, so he closed it again. Ernie tried another, more confident, howdy. What are you boys doing up here? Didn't you run into Daddy and Ed? They went to town with Mom. I'm here alone reading. Do you boys read? Ernie said, cows. Looking for cows. Can't you find any? Very damn few. You boys look thirsty to the bone. Can I get you some water? Oscar was staring slack-jawed at the girl's breasts. Her nipples were pushing hard against her halter top. She had to bend forward to get out of the lounge chair. It was unsurvivable. He watched her tiny waist, how it swept out into ample hips. He watched her as she turned and entered the house. Ernie said, "You could stop talking now, Oscar." Oscar clapped his mouth shut. When Kathy came out onto the porch again, they were both scrunching their faces oddly, attempting to memorize her ass and her sublimely round breasts, barely cupped in the halter top. Then they fixed their gazes on the ground. Kathy had a Dixie cup in each hand, about the size of a shot glass. She stretched cat-like as she handed them up. God, they were thirsty. They tossed back the thimble-sized servings and handed back the green paper cups. Want some more? No thanks, that sure was good. I guess we'd better be getting along. Really well put together, so I kind of became fond of her. At the end of her life, I think that putting a horse down the old-fashioned way is probably preferable for the horse. It's just a lot harder for the person. But so when it came to the end of that horse's life, I tried to weasel out of it, and I called a friend of mine who's a vet and said, "Clay, will you come up here and euthanize that horse?" And he said, "Sure, but you don't have a dog, do you?" And I said, "Well, not at the moment, but why?" And he said, "Because the injection that we give horses to euthanize them is so poisonous that it'll kill anything else that gets on that carcass." Now, where I live, there's anywhere from like 1 inch to 2 feet of topsoil, and underneath that, it's granite for 30 miles straight down. Excuse me. So digging a hole of any size is not really an option. And so if I'd had Clay come up to put that horse down, I would have been creating my own biohazard. Kill a couple of bears, a couple of lions, a few coyotes, numerous raptors. So we had to go back to the old-fashioned way. But that's the end, and this first poem is from early on. It's called "The War That Isn't What You Think." The little wind I saw curving and lifting the black mare's mane never came this way, though I waited, face tilted, to wind as heliotropic is to sun. We have to keep our disappointment alive. We have to sustain our appall, act surprised that humanity has, again today, failed to evolve away from meanness, that we ourselves have failed in this. Invisible earth, I still can't feel any wind, can't feel though I hear cottonwood leaves that hung still, turn sudden, turn all at once, like small birds in a flight of small birds turning, like one thing instead of many, turn silver side to the wind when it comes, shiver and moan when it comes, O wind immaculate that lifts the mane, immaculate that turns the silver leaves, that bears away the smoke of sacrifice. The wind, when it finds me, bears no trace of sage sweet horse smell, no color black, no softness of the muzzle of the mare, her mane curving and lifting where she grazes the horizon down to nothing. And this poem is also about that horse, and it's called Stories Are Made of Mistakes, which I believe to be true. Stories are made of mistakes. Even the pole bean tendrils sawed out and gripped their frames within 6 hours of my setting them. One of the things that is breaking my heart is that I can't trust language to express any thanks. My pole beans, my honeybees, my coyotes, my dog, all my good horses. The black mare I shouldn't have bought, and once I had, should have shipped, bucked me too the first time I got up, but God, she was a beauty. I thought if I just rode her, I could ride her down. Her name was Sarah, and we kept it at that. All she wanted to do was run. Ears back, flat out, nose pushed into the next life. I wanted her to learn to walk. After about a year of chop, I turned her uphill on a good gravel road and said, "Okay, you bitch, you want to run?" I let go her head and gave her the steel. I'd never been on a horse so fast. I've never been on one since. So fast you couldn't count the beats in the rhythm of her gait. Suicidal. But when after some miles she started to flag, I said, "I thought you wanted to run," and dug her out again. The pole bean tendrils sought their frames within 6 hours of my setting them. They broke my heart. They gripped. A patch of sunlight modeled the shade. Whether she never saw the root that snaked through the shadow or was just too far in front of herself, I'll never know. She stumbled and fell, first on her knees, then over. We rasped together down the gravel road, black mare on top of me. We rasped to a halt. She jumped to her feet. She stared at me. I could see the bone in both her knees, ribbons of hide hanging, blood like volunteer firemen beginning to rise to the occasion. 10 years later, today, I'm riding her. I keep her reined in most of the time. She tosses her heads, snaps tie downs. She dances and whirls, doubles under and rears incessantly. She makes me the butt of ridicule. So, Jim, how old is that mare? She must be 20 now. Don't you think it's time she was broke? Every once in a while, I let her run and break my heart. Anyone watching stops breathing. If I ever get to heaven and know who I am, I'd like to overhear my daughter tell a story to her children. Sometimes my dad used to ride this black mare. And the last poem I'll read is the last poem I wrote about that horse. It's called Putting Down the Night. The whole night sky went bad in the knees, nothing to pin it up but stars. I held the whole night sky pinned up with stars on a short tether and pulled the trigger. All but a few stars fell in streaks like sudden rain. That wasn't supposed to happen. But then, what is? So now the night sky is part of everything. I did that. Small and coincidental, I was still recognizable on my wave of ruin. The stars that were left I named the Constellation Halter, and I carried it in my left hand. Don't get me wrong, that wasn't the only night. There is no end to nights of stars, northern light nights, night skewbald and bay. And what did all the other nights think when I led mine away into the woods where our footfalls on dry pine needles crackled, a self-fulfilling prophecy of hell just before it's lit? I'd like a rainy night right about now. I'd like a whole remuda of rainy nights and snowy nights, nights with more stars than spaces between stars, all pressed together against the black gate, eyes on the woods, where I disappeared with my night sky on her tether. I'd like to know what they thought, if nights have thoughts, when I came out of the woods alone, smelling of gunpowder, a loose halter of stars in my hand that I hung on a nail for the rain to wash the blood away, the rain that never rains, the rain I remember like the long streaks of her forelock down over her moss-agate eyes. That's it. Thank you.